Hello and welcome to the Natura Urbana, the Brachen of Berlin Urban Ecology panel discussion. I'm Jules Cooch, Manager of Public Outreach and Education at the UCLA Mildred E. Mathias Botanical Garden here in Los Angeles, California. And I first learned about this documentary from a friend of the garden, Mike Harding, who attended a program we held called Street Plants, the Urban Flora of LA, which you might hear more about later in this discussion. And I was just captivated by this film, by Natura Urbana. It tells a fascinating story of our relationship with plants, some of whom are perhaps some of the quietest residents of our cities. And to offer a little bit of context, if you have yet to visit the UCLA Mildred E. Mathias Botanical Garden, this is a little sample of it. But it's a very wild garden. Our narratives focus on looking at biogeography and the evolutionary history of plants. So we've tried to make a more organic feel that looks like tiny little ecosystems, in contrast to some gardens that have very manicured rose gardens or lawns or things like that. So it definitely appeals to me that Natura Urbana looks into these more organic, spontaneous nature spaces and what value they have in a city in contrast to some of those more well-kept, manicured spaces, and really thinking about how we can both understand and protect them. So we're coming together here in this unique time of physical distancing to discuss the evolution of these unique green spaces in Berlin and how the concerns around development there today reflect similar issues we have here in Los Angeles. I'd like to thank all of you at home for joining us for this conversation, and I'd like to welcome our panel of experts. So I'm super grateful you can all join us for this conversation, especially Sandra, who co-authored this film, who's with us today in Berlin. So could each panelist please introduce yourself, the institution you're a part of, and really briefly, kind of what's your connection to urban ecology?
Should I start?
Yes, that'd be great.
Yeah. Hi, my name is Sandra Jasper. I'm a junior professor of geography and gender at the Humboldt University in Berlin in Germany. And I'm also, besides being a researcher, I'm also part of a film project. I was co-author and also co-producer of Natura Urbana, the Brachen of Berlin, which we will be discussing today in detail, so I'm not going to say much more about it now. And the film is part of a larger project about urban nature in different cities worldwide, not only in Berlin, but also in London, Chennai in India, and Tallinn in Estonia. That were some of the cases that we looked at through the research project, led by Professor Matthew Gandy at the University of Cambridge.
Thank you.
Hey guys, sorry about that. I'm Evan Meyer. I'm the executive director at the Theodore Payne Foundation. Sitting outside in my yard, and there's like a light is kind of coming in, so I'll be moving my camera a little bit to avoid getting light all over me. But I think of this idea of urban nature and urban plants from two perspectives. I would say one is as a field botanist, and so I have a project observing the wild plants of Los Angeles, basically as a field botanist would, and looking at where they grow and why they grow there. And that's called street plants, which Jules just mentioned. And then the other one is as a horticulturist, which is something I've also done throughout my career. And in that case, that's what I do at Theodore Payne Foundation. We sell plants and teach people how to grow California native plants in order to bring native biodiversity to cities. So those are the two kind of areas I'd like to explore today in our talk.
I'm like, are you going first, Kat, or am I? Okay.
Ladies first, you can go.
Thanks. So hi, everyone. I'm Leela Higgins. I work at the Natural History Museum of Los Angeles County. I run the community science program there, also known as citizen science in many places around the world. I have worked on helping to connect people to nature, specifically urban nature. And I co-authored this book, Wild LA, all about the wild and amazing spaces and places around Los Angeles. You can see this, the LA River, yay, Griffith Park, and a bear and a swimming pool. Yeah, that's really what I focus on. I get to work at the Natural History Museum with amazing scientists and educators and help to create the nature gardens there, 3.5-acre wild space in the city. And also the Nature Lab, which also focuses on telling those stories about nature. We really wanted people to be able to experience the nature outdoors and not have too many signs to make their directed attention have to focus on that. Whereas we wanted their fascinated attention to be able to be focused in the outdoor space and have some respite from the museum going experience. There's a thing called museum fatigue. And so the Nature Lab is the space where we get to kind of tell the stories about the amazing biodiversity of Los Angeles and how we are in a biodiversity hotspot, which a lot of people don't know. Thanks.
Well, thank you, everyone.
Sorry,
Kat, go ahead.
Good morning. I'm Kat Superfisky, and I'm trained as an ecologist as well as a landscape architect. And so my life is essentially devoted to figuring out how to merge all the different systems together, from environmental systems to economic systems to social systems. And the best place to be doing that is in the heart of cities. We've oftentimes really looked at cities as kind of destructive places that are anti-nature. And in doing so, I think that we're missing a huge opportunity. And so I'm one of the folks who are joined by many other folks on this panel and across the globe that are really looking to cities as saviors for helping us to really think about how it is that we're interacting with one another, and how it is that we're interacting more mindfully with the world around us and creating what I like to call symbiotic spaces and symbiotic cities, places that we as humans can inhabit, and they're our natural habitat, but they're also still habitat for plants and animals that should be living amongst us as well. So I serve right now as the City of Los Angeles' urban ecologist. And I also run a nonprofit called Grown in LA, and I'm based here in LA and just fighting the good fight every day to bring back more urban nature.
Wonderful. Thanks, everyone. So I thought we could start just addressing, the format of this event changed because of the current pandemic going on in the world, and this directive for physical distancing we've seen evidence around the world that that some of the negative human impacts on the environment are being lessened during this time. And I think in the film, they really look at the Brachen as a beautiful example of, I think they say, nature's ability to reconquer spaces. So I'm just wondering, are there any ways that you're observing this decrease in human activity impacting the nature in your city? Or are there any things we can learn from or take advantage of during this unique time?
One thing that I've kind of noticed is that when you're stuck at home, I mean, here in Los Angeles, we have a lot of beautiful trails and we can leave the city pretty easily. But right now, because we're sheltering at home, we can't necessarily do that. So times like this, the nature in your local environment, in your yard or your community, your neighborhood, it becomes so much more important because we can't drive to Joshua Tree or go hike in the San Gabriel Mountains. So I think from a human perspective, we're finding beauty and inspiration in cities more than ever right now.
And I think it's evoking a really interesting conversation amongst landscape architects and planners and other folks who are in the design community, because it really is bringing to light what Evan was mentioning, is that we have so many different opportunity areas and spaces within cities, oftentimes that we just forget, and we're not thinking of them as open space on par with a park. So for instance, just the street and the right of way out in front of your house. That might be the only opportunity that somebody has right now to connect with nature. Your balcony, an alleyway. There's these tiny little strips that, again, we might not be thinking about in the past that I think people are more apt to be paying attention to and being aware of now. And I think that, again, it's providing a really unique and amazing opportunity for us to really rethink how it is that we're building cities. And I think that we saw that polarity between what happened with the pandemic in New York and what's even happening here in LA, just based on the dispersal of how we have a very highly compacted city We have a much more sprawling city. So I just think that right now we have a lot of lessons to learn. And I think that, again, when we kind of rebuild the systems in place, I think we'll have a great opportunity to get people to realize that nature is literally around them always.
Just to follow up on that point of awareness, I also noticed that especially being on a balcony or on the street with lesser traffic, for example, on the streets, and also lesser air traffic, you actually start, your senses started to being aware of nature much more, like listening to birds, for example, that are sometimes drowned out by the kind of everyday street traffic. And actually animals, nature making its presence much more felt in a way. And then I have a little anecdote, and I don't know if it has to do with the current situation or not, but I've just encountered, for example, a wild boar in the forest in Berlin. And I've heard of the wild boar many times, but I've never seen one. So I just ran into one the other day. So you can really, there are many stories also on the news right now about, I don't know, sheep returning to cities or goats, etc. So people might be more aware of these kind of incidences or encounters with nature.
Yeah, there was, I think the goats were in Wales.
Yes,
And here in California, there were ground squirrels overtaking a park in Santa Monica that was on TMZ. And they were literally just, it looked like they were sunbathing. It looked like a scene of like humans in a park, like relaxing in the sun, but it was ground squirrels.
Fantastic. So here today also we have representatives from lots of different types of institutions, from government, academia, design, sort of nonprofit, museum. I'm wondering what do you think is the role or tools each of these different sectors have? Because I think we see in the film it takes political backing. It takes getting the community really together and connected to make changes, to fight those big freeways, or to think about sort of different ways of valuing nature. So I guess, what are the ways that your type of institution can help value and protect nature in the city? Or what tools do you have, Leila?
So because I work at a museum, we have researchers, scientists in the building. We have an urban nature research center with herpetologists who study reptiles and amphibians. We have an entomologist who studies insects. We have an ornithologist who studies birds. We have a mammologist who studies mammals. So we've got someone who studies spiders, a snail and slug scientist, malacologist. We've got this really wide, diverse range of scientists who were doing research in more remote places, but now more and more scientists are studying nature in urban places. And they came together because they wanted to do this work in Los Angeles. And as part of the Community Science Office, we partner with them to get the public involved in that research. Every 10 steps you take in Los Angeles, you're on a new piece of private property often. And so for a researcher to do field work in that space, it's really, really difficult. Unlike going out to the deserts or tropical rainforests where every 10 steps you're on just another piece of forest land. So we really have to engage the community, and a museum is an amazing place to do that because we not only have the researchers, we also have education specialists, we also have IT departments and marketing communications and advancement and philanthropy going on all in the same building. So it's a really kind of, and we're big, but we're not too big. And so we're kind of small enough to be nimble and to kind of do these things and make these projects and programs that are really responsive. So like last week, the painted lady butterfly migration was happening. Everyone's stuck at home. We were able to really quickly get a project up and going where people can go out for 10 minutes during their lunch breaks or with their kids because they're at home and count the, not monarchs, painted lady butterflies that are migrating through. And in some institutions, in some places, you can't do that in like a few-day turnaround. So I think that that's one of the big benefits of working at the Natural History Museum or in a museum in general.
I'll really quickly add to what Leila was saying, which is the community aspect. That's where I think Theodore Payne Foundation really can add a lot to this. Is our kind of mission is to educate people how to cultivate gardens, and they can buy the plants from us. We have a large nursery, and we try to help homeowners create more diversity and ecological diversity within their own small spaces. So, you know, that I think is a really important part of solving this or moving us further along, is to have more public buy-in and more people contributing to this cause and creating diversity in their own space. And part of the way that you do that is to bring native plants into the fold. They support the specialist pollinators. So, you know, getting some native diversity in every yard, I think, would really increase the ecological interactions that we would see in the city of Los Angeles. So that's, I think, the biggest thing that we're adding to it.
And I can kind of even piggyback off of that and then explain that through the work of the government, there is a giant opportunity to really affect a lot of large-scale change based on the plans and policies that are put in place. So for the last 6 years, was in the private sector as an urban ecologist, and I deliberately shifted over to the government in realizing that now is really the time to be codifying a lot of these important perspectives and these important initiatives in our government. Because it will literally then help to trickle down to make sure that any of the projects that we are seeing built, any of the private residential projects, any of the commercial buildings, any of the public parks that we're managing, the more that we can institutionalize the importance of nature and ecology in a city like Los Angeles, the more, again, that's going to radiate out, and one kind of insertion in terms of one regulation or one planning guiding document, one goal, one target, that can have an amazingly important impact on what it is that we're seeing around us. And so I'm happy to say that the city of Los Angeles is doing a tremendous job across the board of looking at what it is that we can do on our own private or on our own public properties. But then similarly, one of the specific projects I'm working on is looking at development regulations for private property, of how it is that we can try to encourage folks to be providing habitat and connectivity opportunities for wildlife, for plants and animals to live in concert along with us. And so really, I think that, again, the government's role is to help. I think of it like a bumper bowling parent, where we don't let you fall off into the gutters if you're bowling. You kind of stay in the lane. So providing, again, some of those kind of the guidance mechanisms to make sure that we're all moving in the right direction.
So I'm hearing a lot with the ways that you're impacting. So much of it has to do with directly communicating with the community. And I think one of the things that's so interesting in the film is the way that language is used and the importance that it has. And specifically, that it's inextricable to storytelling. I, as an educator myself, I really think about that I'm here to tell stories for plants. And so they also talk about how some of the words that you can use can be really helpful or really destructive. And I think it's Suzanne Hauser, the professor, who describes words like the native, non-native, and invasive can be really politically charged and polarizing, and they can easily translate to groups of people and how welcome or rather unwelcome they can feel in a city. And she describes the use of the word adventive plants, or plants that arrived here as an alternative. So I'm wondering, with thinking about language, how can we both celebrate and protect native flora while representing the stories of all plants in our city that have established themselves here, or thinking about sort of how does language we use in science impact our identity as a city? Yeah, Sandra.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, I would be really curious to learn more about the discussions in LA or maybe in California as a whole around native, non-native species, because I'm sure there's differences, and this is really key also in scientific research to understand the kind of local differences in the use of language, but also in the kind of histories of botanical knowledge. For example, in the film, were in a specifically kind of post-war German context, and in that specific context, it was explicitly important to kind of start valuing non-native plants in these kind of wasteland ecologies, because there's a history of kind of Nazi era planning and the idea of a nativist landscape, etc. So that is a very particular kind of German discourse around plants and ecology and landscape planning as well. So yeah, I'd be curious to hear more about kind of your ideas around these kind of terminologies, because they must be different, I assume.
Yeah, that's a really interesting thing. I didn't realize that until watching the film. And then also I have a Twitter account which is devoted to my street plants project, and somebody made this like nationalist attack on my project because I was showing them Tipuana Tipu, and it was like a very nationalist approach. I didn't really realize that was a thing until the last couple of years, but I think it's to some extent just semantics. Like, I'm from New England, and every time I go home to New England in the summertime, I see signs for native corn and native peaches, and I'm like, come on, guys, they're grown, locally grown. So yeah, I think a lot of it is semantics. I mean, I think to some extent there needs to be a useful term for plants that support indigenous biodiversity, because if we just and that's right now, that's native and non-native. I'm not. I think the nationalistic thing is probably a pretty small portion of people, like extremist opinions, and I don't. Until there's a better term, I mean, that's just the one that we would use. But it certainly is something that is really interesting, and valuing ecology as part of your decisions with the plants that you utilize in your cities, I think needs to be done more. I know it's something Kat is working a lot on, and her team. But how do we do that without using the terms native and non-native? We could come up with some new terms to do it. I mean, because certain non-native plants to LA do support wildlife well. There's obviously hummingbird pollinated plants and plants that provide coverage, but yeah, at the present, I think they're sort of the best we have, and the nationalist kind of weird stuff like that in the US, I don't think is that big of an issue. Maybe it's more of an issue in Europe.
Leila?
So I think that this was one of the things that really struck me about the film, and I was really thankful to see that was the case, because I don't think this is always what happens in science. Science sometimes, and scientists sometimes view themselves as apolitical based on just evidence, but there was one quote in there that science is political. We just can't get away from it. And language is really powerful and brings so much kind of baggage to the table. And that's why we changed the name of our program from citizen science to community science. In Southern California, it is a very polarizing term. Myself, as a non-citizen in the United States, I feel it, but I come with a lot of privilege into my work here in Southern California as a white woman coming from England with a British accent. I get privileges that I don't deserve, I get them. So we were approached by members of the community that wanted to change the name. Our president of the museum wanted to change the name, and some of our politicians in county government wanted to change the name. And I was very, very for that, but I wanted to make sure that we were very mindful about how we went about changing the name and documenting it, so to speak. So we wrote an opinion piece, which we published on our website. And some of the people who work at the museum who had citizen science in their title could not literally tell their family members that was their title, because it connoted too much about who belongs and who doesn't belong. And I know one of my friends who works at Audubon, Marcos Trinidad, he was very vocal and also helped to change the terminology at Audubon Center, and is also very vocal about the native, non-native language that we're using. And I think that it is the language that we have right now, but that doesn't mean that we can't go about making that change, just like we have taken a stand at the Natural History Museum to change from citizen science to community science. And I sometimes feel like it's easy to say that's what we have right now, and until someone else does the work to change it, we're just going to keep doing what we're doing. But I think sometimes we have to make that change. So there's me on my soapbox about language.
And the last thing that I'll just add, actually, going off of how you were saying the word change, of that, to me, these kind of, a lot of times terminology too, to me, creates static moments and static expectations. And I guess I would love to see us develop vocabulary that allowed for evolution to happen, adaptation to happen over time. And thinking of, yeah, Evan's 100% right. We can't negate the importance of certain types of flora and fauna that make a lot of sense here. But we also know that there are a lot of conditions that are changing here. So how is it that we can broaden our perspective and welcome certain types of other species in, if and when appropriate? And I think that that's what I have seen the biggest hiccup, at least in my work, of that if you give somebody a certain term, they believe that that's the only answer. And oftentimes they're looking to a static or looking to the past. Whereas I see much more promise in us seeing what's here now, what's going on here now, where do we want to go, and how do we get there? So I would love for us to, again, be able to come up with some sort of a word bank that allowed for still hearkening on the past, but then really helping to kind of push us forward towards the future that we know we're going to get to.
Yeah, and I'll just add one more thing that I think, to speak for the native plant community, if I may, I think a lot of times they feel like they're fighting, they're basically fighting the landscape, the urban landscape as it is, because most plants are not native. Most of them are not particularly good for supporting wildlife or creating a sense of regional identity for Southern California. So that's why I think to approach this cautiously, where like, it's not like that fight has been won already. Maybe in certain circles that idea is accepted, but it's not a societal norm by any chance. And most plantings are not particularly good, in my opinion. They don't support, like they're not sustainable even. So I think treading lightly so that we're honoring the hard work that's been gone into moving the needle over the last 50 years, while being more open and allowing for more people to come into this movement to be more enlightened with the way that we manage our landscapes.
And I know, kind of speaking to the garden in this instance, there are lots of values we can have that are kind of like Kat was talking about, that are more ecosystem service related. So in the case of Southern California, being drought tolerant, or different things like that is really beneficial. So how can we support both? How can we have to value native plantings, but also kind of transitioning more into these broader definitions that include plants that are helpful, in contrast to some of those ones that are evolutionary, really astounding competitors. We think about what makes a plant strong or great. They can grow rapidly, they can reproduce wildly, make some of those plants that become the most frustrating to a city, that are the most devastating and really crowding out the native plants. So it's a challenging thing to figure out what kind of words to use. So if you're watching at home and you have some good suggestions, feel free to email me back with your rhetoric around nativeness, invasiveness, and non-native plants. I think another question kind of related to the language we use is that there's so many different ways to map a city, neighborhood maps, watershed maps, all these different things. And the film, they look at those biotype maps. And I think that also gets to the sense that urban ecology is so much older than I think a lot of people realize, that those conversations were happening in the 1950s or even before that. And in the biotype mapping, they have all these different codes of like an airstrip, a sports field, all these different places. And I think it really asks us to see ourselves as an animal in the ecosystem, and to realize when we have these kooky little behaviors, when we're creating a road and then the, excess of nutrients or different things are coming off of the road, how does that impact plants? and really impact the species around us. So I'm wondering, this is perhaps a little more silly one, but what's a way we can remind people that we are a part of the ecosystem rather than outside of it?
I wonder if like the crisis that we're living through right now is doing that to some extent, where like it just shows how fragile our economy is, and I think that then can filter out to all these different aspects of life, including, you know, how fragile maybe our place in nature is. I don't know, maybe that's a silver lining where people will become a little bit more thoughtful about the impact they're having on the planet through this, you know, strange and horrible situation that we're living through right now.
Yeah, and I think it's an interesting thing that's going to take a lot of educating and encouraging, because it's requiring a perspective shift. And so the one thing that I finally, after living in LA for, again, like 6 or 7 years, I finally realized, oh, I see LA, I think, a lot differently than everybody else when I walk and drive around. I'm actually seeing it as the natural systems. I see the mountains, I see the riverways, I see the basin area and the wetlands, and then I see the buildings on top of them. And so I'm first still like in my ecosystem manager life and perspective. And so I'm constantly seeing the nature first and then seeing how it is that we built over top and around it. Whereas I feel like a lot of people show up to cities and they see the city first. And so it's just asking them to kind of, again, flip the perspective or merge the perspective a little bit better. And so I think that, again, like the work that, you know, Theodore Payne Foundation, Natural History Museum, who are getting this kind of word out, who are educating, who are helping to make those kind of personal connections to nature, I think makes a lot of sense. And I think it comes down to like even silly, tiny little things like signage. I mean, Leela and I tell the story all the time about how important it was when the LA River finally got signs that showed as you're driving over the river, hey, there's a river down there. So from small little tiny things like that, that just get people to start seeing the world around them a little bit differently. And I don't think that signage is, you know, the be all end all. And I don't think it's the only thing that we should be doing, but it gives an example of, again, like something as small as that, of just helping people to acknowledge the nature around them. And I think that that can come in a variety of different ways. And I think it is very essential because, again, I see most people still kind of looking at cities as just kind of built infrastructure, and that they don't necessarily then have the belief that we can really actually still have that infrastructure and still function as a city, but still have all of these other kind of benefits through, you know, flora and fauna as well.
I think one of the things that can help to flip that perspective, like Kat was saying, one of the things we did in the nature lab was to share the stories of people about their nature memories. So we've done nature memory mapping, and there are 16 maps at the front of the nature lab that help to tell the stories of different people, specific individuals, on what their memories are of nature in Los Angeles. So from my favorite one being the elementary school students at Leo Politi Elementary. And so I went to the school and had them close their eyes and remember their schoolyard and draw their memories of what happened and happens on that schoolyard. And they had put in a native garden. So it's absolutely something that's brought up so many amazing stories. And they're like, that there was the one day that the red-tailed hawk ate a pigeon on the playground. There was one day when a hummingbird came into the classroom, and I wonder what the hummingbird was thinking. And another student saying, I watched a spider spin a web on this monkey flower plant. I'm not like inserting the names. These are the kids using these names in their memory maps. And they knew it was a monkey flower, and they're like, it was an orb weaver spider, and it spun the web, and then I watched it, and then 3 days later it was gone. So I think that that's an example for kids, but any adult, we can all do that. We can all sit down. And I think especially like during this time right now, when we are connecting more with our neighborhood nature and our backyard nature and the nature we can see from our houses, because we are so isolated, kind of taking that time to kind of be thankful for the nature that is around us and noticing it more. because we're not quite so busy.
And a quick follow-up to that. If you right now were an animal in your city, what animal would you be, and what would your habitat be like?
Okay. I hope you can hear me. I have a sign that my internet is a bit unstable here, but okay. I think at the moment, because I've been just engaging so much with this bird, I would probably be a skylark. And my habitat would be on the Tempelhof Airfield, which is a former airport in Berlin that has been transferred into a park. And I would have a fantastic spring, because this kind of habitat is quite unique. It's one of the largest sites for skylarks, I think in Europe, maybe worldwide. So yeah.
I'm gonna have to piggyback off of the bird as well. Ever since I've been a kid, I've been so jealous of birds because they have wings and they can fly. And gee whiz, I really wish that I could do that. So although I love legs and being able to move around on the ground, if I got to be an animal, I would definitely be a bird. And I think that specifically I would be an osprey that lives with the other osprey down the block from me. It's on, they have their roost and their nest over on the Taylor Yard G2 parcel, and they use the LA River to make a happy home. And so I feel like, again, it would be amazing to be able to share that space with them and to be able to watch from so many different levels the things that I see just as a human and a little ant on the ground, but in my same neighborhood, but from way high above. So yeah, I would definitely be an osprey on the LA River.
I've been stalking a corpulent possum with my daughter, and though I kind of find possums a little bit frightening and frankly kind of creepy animals, this one seems like he's living a good life. He's like by far the fattest possum I've ever seen in my life, and he's just cruising around our neighborhood. It seems like he's happy there, and I wouldn't have to move far. So
I would definitely be a ladybug. I would be the convergent ladybug, Hippodamia convergens. They overwinter up in the mountains, and then when it gets warmer, literally they can be under the snow, in the tree bark, thousands and hundreds of them. And then when it gets warmer and the days get longer and more plants kind of come into bloom down in the lowlands, they will migrate down, and you can see them on weeds along the streets, like the mallows that are popping up all over LA right now. You can find them eating aphids in a vegetable garden. You could find them on native vegetation as well. So I would definitely want to be a ladybug because I could fly, but I could also be like the lioness of the Los Angeles lowlands.
I think that I would have to choose a hummingbird. That was, I'm not from Los Angeles either. I grew up in Michigan, where we have very few hummingbirds. And here they're such a dramatic part of the neighborhood. They're loud, they're aggressive. People think of them as being really, really tiny and cute, but they're just this like radiant explosion of colors. And right now seeing them build the tiniest little nests and lay tiny, tiny little eggs. I think they're pretty extraordinary, cool creatures and seem very unfazed by the urban environment. Cool. So thinking about, so some of you mentioned these habitats are existing in these post-industrial spaces, right? In the airfield or, you know, parts of the LA River that have been totally filled with concrete. And so I think similar to Berlin, Los Angeles is faced with rapid development. And these sort of disturbed post-industrial landscapes they're sometimes undervalued, but they hold so much potential, especially in these cities where the cost of land is a premium and it's a barrier to sort of public ownership of land and of space. I think Evan mentioned it before, the Naturpark Südgelände, forgive me on the pronunciation, seems like such a great win in terms of this work. So I'm wondering about as these areas are converted from industrial applications into park space, what value is there to that seemingly wild, spontaneous, organic space in contrast to heavily manicured green spaces like playgrounds or more formally built parks?
I think, there's two issues going on here. One is just access to green space, which there obviously should be more of. I don't think anybody would disagree with that. I think the idea that these interstitial, novel ecosystems should be our green space is sort of a cop-out. It's like, well, they just happen to be there, so that's the best we're going to get. That's our green space. Because to me, as a horticulturist, I know that you can construct habitat any way you want, really. Not any way, but there's ways to do that. So if you think about it from the point of view of a restoration ecologist or a horticulturist, it's kind of like we just ended up with these random communities of plants. Not to say that they're inherently bad, but they're just a product of history. They're because a lot of times we moved those plants around for various reasons. Like I think of like castor bean, which was an industrial crop, or tree tobacco was an ornamental plant, Mexican fan palm ornamental plant. So it's kind of like, why would you settle for those to be your green space when you could have something that's more beautiful, more interesting, and more unique? Because those are the same plants that you're going to see in cities all over the world with the same climate. And if I think of it from the perspective of a builder, or like, say you're constructing nature, what we have there, it's almost like someone just took a whole bunch of raw materials and tossed them in, and they just became this jarbled thing. And that's like, if you're going to build a house, you wouldn't just take a bunch of building materials and like toss them into a pile and be like, okay, there's some shelter under those boards, I'll live in there. It's like, no, you construct it and build it to be exactly what you want. So those are the two issues at play. I think access to green space, great, but if that's going to be our green space, let's put more effort into making it more diverse and beautiful and interesting. And I think it can be totally wild and unmanicured, but still have a lot of intent behind it. And I think of UCLA Botanical Garden as a good example. It looks pretty wild, but it's heavily maintained. And so I wouldn't just settle for these novel ecosystems. Again, I think they're interesting, but I think we can do better.
And that's, I think, the wild aspect is the part that I would not want to lose at all. And that's the part that, to me, actually defines nature. So to me, I've realized that nature is not necessarily woods or water or like the sun, mountains, these elements. It's more of the experience that I feel. I feel a sense of mystery. I feel a sense of challenge. I feel a sense of that exploration. That to me makes me feel as though I'm in nature. And so one of the main reasons that I like right now a lot of these interstitial spaces, the post-industrial landscapes, is because these open spaces, more than a lot of our designed public parks, are providing me with the opportunity to have a little bit of free play, to be able to decide where it is that I go and how it is that I explore, to feel as though it's a little bit of a challenge. It's not an easy paved path. It's not a seat wall that's already constructed for me. It's not that there's already a trash can I have to figure out how to pack in or pack out what I pack in. So to me, I think that I would love for, yes, for us to design our public parks to include more diversity, but I would also really like that to be diversity of experiences, to where we're not necessarily just giving standard picnic tables, standard, pit stops, standard ball fields, but we're really thinking differently about how it is that we're offering a lot of different unique experiences for people. So that, again, that sense of wild is not necessarily, lost with the kind of redesign and scraping a site clean and deciding, what the next phase is going to be.
Yeah, it makes me think immediately of the bow tie parcel along the LA River.
That's where I was too in my brain.
And how literally the first time I went there, I was like, I'm so happy that this has been purchased as space that will not be developed. However, I don't want to see this developed in the way a lot of parks get developed.
Leila, could you describe what the bow tie is for little?
So the bow tie parcel is literally the shape of a bow tie if you're looking at it from like a plan view, like Kat's doing right there, on the east bank of the LA River, really close to Fletcher Boulevard, which goes over the river. and it's a kind of post-industrial landscape. It's right next to the Taylor Yard, where a lot of train industry was happening. And it is a space that the state parks, California State Parks, purchased and has been partnering with Clock Shop to program that space, but has basically done not much in like, there's no landscaping been done. There's been some art installations. Kat and I helped to create the very first LA River camp out there. So we literally camped alongside the LA River. But the space is, because it has not been programmed by landscape architects. I'm not a landscape architect, so you'll see some bias coming out here. Because it has not been programmed by landscape architects, any visitor that goes can put whatever they want onto the landscape. It's kind of like loose parts theory in play, which was came up with in 1970s by Simon Nicholson, where like a loose part is basically like a pine cone or a stick or a rock, and the kid can use their imagination to create that to be whatever they want it to be. Unlike, say, a Buzz Lightyear toy, which is like only going to be a Buzz Lightyear toy and is only going to say to infinity and beyond. A loose part can do anything. And so I like the idea of the Brachen and spaces like the Bowtie parcel, where the person who comes in can kind of put what they want onto that space and have it be what they want it to be. And so I would love to see designed spaces like some of the Brachen have become designed into parks, where that is preserved. And I would love to see that for the Bowtie parcel. And I feel like sometimes landscape architects can go too far and then make it so programmed that then it's only got like a limited range of functions. I would love to hear landscape architects defend their work and say, no, Leela, you're wrong. So over to Kat and other people who have other opinions.
I was gonna say, I'm not that landscape architect that would be, I'm obviously on the flip side of the coin, where I'm trying to, you know, preserve as much of that, the other kind of experiences as possible. And I'm not necessarily into, again, scraping sites clean and just, you know, building whatever I think needs to go there, and just kind of the standard stereotypical stuff. But again, that's just my kind of personal opinion and excitement in terms of the field of landscape architecture.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, to me, there's a couple of kind of tricky questions that we have to deal with when designing wastelands into parks that also come out in the film. First of all, there's the question, is the park mainly for humans or mainly for biodiversity? And in the case of biodiversity, is there already existing biodiversity, or do we actually have to intervene to create a more biodiverse space? As you mentioned already, sometimes these spaces are actually not that interesting in terms of biodiversity. In the case of Berlin, many of them actually were, especially the Nature Park Südgelände, which is a park that's that's more designed for nature than kind of human use or kind of leisure activities, I would say. It's a park where you observe kind of spontaneous nature or kind of ecological succession, etc. And then there's the question of management, I think, and maintenance. When you look at these parks, the idea of a wasteland kind of aesthetic in kind of common understanding is that there's not much maintenance that goes into these parks, but that's actually not always true. There are certain kinds of interventions that need to be made to keep parks biodiverse. In Berlin, for example, they would all develop into woodlands if you wouldn't intervene annually by mowing grass, etc. So yeah, I think there's some tricky questions. This idea that a wasteland is just what it is. It's also kind of this idea of kind of a space being sort of out of time. But if you look at plants in particular, you see that these spaces are changing. They have seasons, and they also have this ecological succession. So I think these are some interesting questions to ask, especially in terms of landscape design, what to do and how to approach post-industrial spaces. And the last point, I think, is regarding to some of these parks in Berlin. They're kind of have opened up new green spaces, being turned from wastelands into parks. So they've become more accessible, or they're now accessible for more people in the kind of community neighborhood. But they also have effects in terms of what's happening around them. So actually these parks are kind of tools of speculation. And once these parks have become kind of established, the neighborhoods become more and more attractive for investors. So what's happening now, especially around Park am Gleisdreieck, is what you might call kind of green gentrification, or these kind of effects that you see much more extremely with cases like the New York High Line, for example.
Yeah, and I would just add liability as well. That's one thing that I know that I've struggled to help answer and to address, and it's something where I think that if, again, we're trying to encourage the wildness, oftentimes nature is seen as scary and unsafe. If you start literally bringing back coastal sage scrub, if you start bringing back these natural communities that are oak woodlands or things like that, you're adding dense shrub mounds, you're adding trees, you're adding places for people to hide, people to live, people to do things that we don't want to be encouraging in parks. And so I think that, again, like that's something that I was actually really interested to, chat with you to understand more of. I know that us in the United States, we're a little bit more of a litigious society, especially here in LA. How is it that even we start to bring back some of these spaces, but do so in a way that is allowing safety to still happen? And also, again, like costs are a huge thing. And you mentioned maintenance too. And, people see, oh, I can mow a lawn for much cheaper and faster than, maintaining a native landscape. It's a misperception. So, but the liability is one of those things of where, again, we're inheriting highly contaminated sites. We're then proposing that we're putting big trees and shrubs and what? And so I think, again, there needs to be a lot of human perspective shift and I think broadening of our ability to accept, our own need to learn how to be safe and what it means to engage in a public space. But I think that, again, those are some of the key challenges that we have moving forward.
And I think a few of you brought up a few kind of different things. One, that we do have these disparities of access to nature. And I think that this really ties into the work that you're doing, Sandra, of storytelling. New York Times had an op-ed recently about the disparity of shade in Los Angeles, and specifically how that connects to socioeconomics of different neighborhoods, and how that lack of trees has a lot of public health benefits, or the lack has a lot of issues for public health. So I'm wondering, as we kind of begin to wrap up here, what are effective ways that individuals in the audience can take action to both appreciate nature in cities and advocate for the purchase, design, and protection of nature spaces in urban areas?
I think one thing that people can do is, sorry, did I just?
No, you're great. Go for it.
Go ahead.
It's a hard question. I think everyone was just thinking.
We're like, I mean, I think of course, we're probably preaching to the choir here, because everyone who's watching this is already interested in this topic, but spend time doing it. And I don't mean to, when I say we can do better than these novel ecosystems, like, that doesn't mean they're not interesting. Like, go check them out. Like, I've spent a lot of time combing through these things, and get inspired and inspire your kids. The more people who care about nature, I think, from a societal level, obviously we have many decades of work to do, but that starts with that inherent love of nature that I think everyone on this panel has, and probably most of you watching all have. That's something that you need to kind of feed and maintain, and that's where, a Mexican fan palm grove in a channelized drainage ditch is pretty cool. I mean, it's not as cool as, other things, according to me, but that's just my opinion. So just get out there, have your own opinion. That's the first step. And then the second step is to, for sure, support nonprofits who are doing this work. You know, buy plants, make donations, support the city, communicate with the city, go to meetings, just engage with it, because it's a really interesting thing to do, and I think it'll bring meaning to your life, and it'll make the world more beautiful for future generations. So I think just the more you can engage in any way, from just checking out the hummingbird, you know, in your flying around your neighborhood, to going to a city council meeting, like the whole gambit. Just the more that people engage with this broadly, the more we'll move the needle towards a more interesting and biodiverse city.
I can't agree with that more. The wide spectrum of things. And the thing that I really encourage folks to do, yes, first and foremost, go out and experience it as yourself and experience it with your family, with your friends. But please also help to share what it is that you're seeing. And so I'm going to kind of ping that over maybe to Leela, if you want to talk a little bit maybe about the City Nature Challenge that's coming up. But for me, again, and I think a lot of us who are scientists living in cities, as was brought up earlier, we can't get onto a lot of properties. We can't understand everything that's going on every parcel of land. But we need to get a better sense of what's here living amongst us and what can be living amongst us. And so one thing that I'm constantly encouraging folks to do is share what it is that they're observing around them, because that goes a tremendous way in terms of them making sure that the plans and policies and projects that we're rolling out on a daily basis are well informed.
So thanks, Kat, for the, putting it up to bat. So yeah, people can get engaged in collecting data about their own neighborhood, their own backyard, their own communities through community science. And a project we have called the City Nature Challenge at the Natural History Museum and at California Academy of Sciences, we partner with our two institutions. It started off as a competition between LA and San Francisco, which city could find the most nature. And that's any evidence of life. It could be a mushroom, it could be slime mold, it could be a track, it could be scat, it could be a bone, a living creature, plant, again, fungus, anything. And you upload it to the iNaturalist app, and then it becomes a data point for science. And it's like a social media platform. So I call it like Facebook for nature nerds. And you can work with other people if you don't know what it is. They have a great artificial intelligence that helps to identify things, but then if you still don't know, then there's the community that can help you make an identification. And once it's agreed upon by the community what this is, it becomes what's called research grade, and then it gets shared with the Global Biodiversity Inventory Facility. And so that means scientists all over the world more scientists all over the world can use it, because iNaturalist is open access, open source. And anyone can download the data. A teacher in a school in the area right around the museum could download the data. A scientist at UCLA or USC could download the data. And I think that we have 200 cities around the world who are participating this year. And clearly, in light of the COVID-19 coronavirus pandemic, things are drastically changing. This is the 5th year we've done the challenge. It's also the 50th anniversary of Earth Day. Last year we had nearly 1 million observations come in from the 160 or so cities around the world. Of course, this year a lot of people can't leave their houses. They're either self-isolating or trying to respect the safer at home, shelter-in-place orders throughout the country. And so we're kind of pivoting to allow people to kind of get the benefits of connecting with nature, because it is really healing. Research shows that being time and spent in nature, even if you're not in nature, but looking at nature through a window, can help heal patients in a hospital faster. If you can get outside and be in a backyard and around plants and animals, your heart rate goes down, your pulse rate, your cortisol levels go down, and it increases overall senses of well-being, and even can boost your immunity because of the exposure to vitamin D, and also the exposure to the phytochemicals that are out there. And so we're pivoting the City Nature Challenge this year. So please take pictures of the plants and animals inside your house, in your own backyard, what you can see from your window. If you have a balcony, what's visiting your planters on your balcony. Maybe you have a hummingbird feeder out front. What species of hummingbird are coming there? And then the last thing I want to say is that these tools for community science, we have designed this project to measure and help document biodiversity around the world. But these tools can be used by anyone, and a lot of communities in Los Angeles and urban places are dealing with a lot of environmental justice issues, and these tools can help community members to document what the issues are, where there is a lack of shade in their neighborhood. I live in Koreatown, one of the densest parts of the city, but I live really close to Larchmont Village, and the disparity of shade is like shocking. And I have the privilege to walk over to the rich neighborhood and be around the shady areas, but then I walk back into my own neighborhood in Koreatown, and there's a dearth of vegetation and no shade when I'm at the bus stop on the way to work. So I think that there are tools that are there to help communities be able to document and collect data, and then help to get change to occur in their own neighborhoods, and for them to advocate. And we at the museum are moving into this arena, and the staff in my office are really excited about partnering with communities to help them collect the data that they need to affect change on local government levels.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, I want to encourage everyone to take part in the City Nature Challenge. I think it's a fantastic idea to develop this app. And what we've learned from the Berlin example and from the botanists you saw in the film is that all these maps and all that kind of knowledge about Berlin, which is quite extensive, could not have been developed without the help of amateurs, citizen science, community groups being engaged in their own neighborhoods, but also people just walking around the city documenting back then in little notebooks and with a camera, and now you can actually do it with your phone, which is fantastic. So yeah, please go out and be part of this.
Wonderful. I'll definitely be out there for the City Nature Challenge, taking photos. I did have the pleasure of seeing a snail the other day with all this rain. So there's a lot out there if you slow down and take a closer look. I want to thank you all so much for sharing your time, thoughts, and potential solutions today. I think that Natura Urbana really highlights that urban ecology is not as new of a discipline as some people might think, and is more relevant today than ever before, as the proportion of the world population that lives in cities is ever growing. And I think it asks us to see that city and nature are not at all separate. And I think in Los Angeles, we know that, but we have a long way to go of getting everyone to see that. So I will leave all of our viewers at home with an invitation that when you finish watching this, to put on your shoes, head outside for a short walk, practicing physical distancing, wearing a face covering if you're in LA, and maybe leave your phone off and let your senses notice the world around you. See what you hear, what you can see and smell, and take in all that nature in your neighborhood. And let's give a round of applause to all of our excellent panelists here today. Thank you so much for joining us. Excellent work. And thank you. And see you next time.